So let's take a closer look at this issue. Scott Thurlow is a founding partner of Thurlow Law. He's joining us today from Ottawa. Scott, you've been involved in election recounts. Tell us the situation.
Sure. So I was retained by the Liberal candidate in Etobicoke Centre in 2011. There was a judicial recount there in front of Madame Justice Himmel of the Ontario Superior Court. The margin of victory in that particular election was 26 votes. The recount was undertaken under the supervision of both the returning officer, the deputy returning officer, and ultimately there were about 200 ballots that went directly before the judge.
And so those 200 ballots, how many of them switched, in terms of the interpretation from what originally had been tallied and what was tallied after the recount?
Well, it's not that they switched. It's that some of them were really easy to figure out what the intent of the electors were, and in some cases it wasn't. So of the 200 ballots, about 175 of them were decided in less than 5 minutes, and then each individual one was determined whether or not it should be rejected or why it should be rejected.
Okay, so I love the fact that you have been in that room and you've seen this process. So describe for us, under what circumstances was a ballot rejected?
So the statute has very specific tests for why a ballot should be counted or not be counted. Now, the first one, the most important one, is that the ballot wasn't issued by the returning officer, right? So normally the returning officer will be signing the ballot on the back. So the people counting the ballots will be able to determine whether or not it's been supplied by them. The second one is whether or not the person voted in the appropriate way. Everyone remembers there's a big circle on the right-hand side of the ballot. Sometimes, though, the elector will circle the name very vigorously and say, that's who my number one choice is. And often those ballots are counted because the intent of the elector is so clear. Now, another one for a rejection is that someone decides to vote for someone who isn't a candidate. So in our situation, someone tried to vote for Spartacus by writing Spartacus across the ballot. Believe it or not, that ballot was actually counted because they did it in the place of one of the candidates and said, I'm voting for Spartacus. Now, the most important one here is that voters who attempt to identify themselves when they cast their ballot. So think of someone whose name is Joe with a twin sister Mary, and they write that on the ballot. That ballot's going to be rejected right away because the elector is identifying themselves.
You're doing a great job, by the way, of explaining all this for us. Not only is it clear, but you're dealing with the duress of what seems to be a house full of pets. So I appreciate that.
Well, free speech for dogs.
Tell us what the mood is like or was like when you were in the room. I mean, you have, fiercely contested elections. A lot is at stake here. Who's going to win? Who's not going to win? How would you describe the mood during the recount?
So for the candidates, it was particularly intense because they didn't know where they were going to be going in the next couple days. In our situation, both sides had 25 volunteers who were going to be doing the initial counts in front of the scrutineers. We had the judge obviously available to us to make rulings if there was some kind of a motion about whether or not a box should be opened or not, or why it should be opened or not. It was 4 days in a pretty bleak mall in Etobicoke, so that had an impact as well. Luckily, our candidate owned a bakery, so we had really good food, if nothing else, for our volunteers and for the legal team that was working on the case.
I love this description. So one last thing. You look at the United States and how there's so little trust in so much when it comes to the election, including those baseless claims that the election in 2020 had been stolen. It hadn't been, but certainly those claims have been made. What should Canadians know about a process that leads to, as we saw in Terrebonne, Quebec, a change and winning a vote by a single ballot? What should Canadians know about the process?
So I've never seen one that close. The closest one I've seen is 7 ballots. So I would say that Canadians should trust the process. The ballots will speak for themselves, and ballots aren't going to be rejected willy-nilly. I mean, Canadians went to the ballot box and they invoked their Section 3 rights when they cast those ballots. So the people who are counting them have to be mindful of that. The fact that someone is expressing their constitutional rights through that ballot process. The other thing I would tell you is that in this particular case, it doesn't look like the government's going to change because, yes, the Liberals can pick up one more seat, but they've got to pick up two. And it can make a difference. So, for example, Stephen Harper's government would have looked very different had Tony Clement not won his recount against then MP Andy Mitchell. And that would have been a different cabinet spot altogether. So there's a lot of very interesting things that are going on. Ultimately, though, the ballots will speak for themselves, and hopefully the electors in these ridings made really clear markings on the ballot.
Yeah, and as of tonight, of course, as you point out, the Liberals 2 seats away from a majority. Scott Thurlow, really fantastic speaking with you. Thank you very much.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.